Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Tony Holland, who I think you all know, awarded the positions of Health Foundation Chair in Learning Disabilities and Head of the Cambridge Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Group in the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge in 2002. And he's done a lot of important work. He has a CBE for services to psychiatry, and he has served as president of IPSWO since 2016 and is the patron of the UK PWS Association. And his talk is present and future treatments for people living with PWS. Yet more questions, but also some answers.
Thank you very much. And, just to say, as I said yesterday, it's always an enormous pleasure to be back in Australia, having lived and worked here many years ago. So thank you very much, Georgina, for inviting me. But I'd like to start by saying what a very excellent program you've had today, because for me, what it illustrated was the importance of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary care and multidisciplinary clinics, really, for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And I was thinking, now, as a psychiatrist, if you're asked to see someone because of their behavioural outbursts or whatever it is, the sorts of questions you'll be asking yourself will not just be related to the behaviour, but you'll be asking, do they have sleep apnea? Because that actually makes my behaviour worse. What's the environment like? Do they have a proper communication strategy wherever the person lives? Do they have a visual timetable? Do they have food security? Are they seeing a dietitian that knows about Prader-Willi syndrome? All those questions need to be asked, because all of those will contribute to behaviour before you even begin to think about whether you prescribe medication or not. And by and large, for behaviour, I think there's a very limited place for medication. It's different when it comes to mental illness. And today has really illustrated that. The speakers have come over, is really knowledgeable about Prader-Willi syndrome. So you've got something very precious here in Australia, and you really need to build on it. And it speaks so much for the Prader-Willi community that is here in this country. So that's wonderful. So now, my talk. Georgina and I, when we were discussing what I might talk about, and it doesn't quite fit, I think, within the program, but I think what we thought would be helpful is if I try and make links between research, new treatments and clinical practice, but also I think in the way one might begin to change one's thinking about Prader-Willi syndrome. I'm a great believer that for parents, it's really important that you have a detailed understanding of what is going on. What is it that your son or daughter may be struggling with, whether it's cognitively or whatever it is, whether it's because of a mood problem or whatever. If you can understand that, then you can begin to work out strategies for yourself about what to do when there are problems arise, such as emotional outbursts. As a psychiatrist, I can't possibly anticipate all the different situations you might face, but if you understand what's going on, then I think you can design for yourself interventions that would be helpful. So, and those of you in the meeting yesterday, you'll recognize some of the slides, but I will be putting a slightly different emphasis on it, although what I'll be talking about is somewhat similar to yesterday. This is the sort of outline for the talk. The top one is developing a unifying theory of Prader-Willi syndrome. This is a sort of rather grand idea, but I strongly believe that we're missing that at the moment, that we still don't properly understand how you link the genetics, which we know a lot about, but we still a lot to learn, but we still know quite a lot about it, to the brain, to the behavior, if you like. We're still missing that link, and I think we're getting closer to that, but I believe that sort of level of understanding is really necessary if we're to make further advances in terms of treatment. So then I want to look at some research and development, or the development of interventions that come from research, and particularly focus on hyperphagia and emotional outbursts. Now, Georgina, you asked me particularly to talk about pharmacogenetics and pharmacodynamics, and I think parents had asked that we talk about that. So I put something in there about that, but I've entitled it "When Treatments Don't Work." because I think there's that is the context of pharmacogenetics, and I'll come to that. Talk a bit about some of the challenges of clinical trials and reflect a bit on some of the future. So that's the outline, I think, for my talk. But what I want to do here is really just try and give you, in the next two slides, this slide and the next one, an overview of the complexity of Prader-Willi syndrome, which in a way you know for yourself, I think, but then try and reflect on how that has to be dealt with in a sort of research context. And often what one has to try and do is to actually narrow things down and ask very precise questions and then step back and set it within the broader context of the syndrome. But what we've got here is you've got, and I love the picture of the little baby there on the top left-hand corner and the young lad with Prader-Willi syndrome on the bottom right corner. What this is all about is how can you ensure that that baby's life is going to be good, that they're going to grow and develop and enjoy life, as this young man, I think, is. But you've got the complex genetics that leads to a pattern of atypical development, something that is present in utero, and mothers, for example, particularly those who it's their second or third baby or whatever, will be able to say there's something unusual, the baby's not kicking or whatever. And we know that the atypical developmental trajectory starts in utero and then is apparent at birth with the extreme floppiness and hypertonia. So that leads you see a pattern of brain development that is atypical, and that is then associated with the core characteristics that we associate, what we call the phenotype of Prader-Willi syndrome, the early phenotype moving into the later phenotype. So I think where we're at is that we now would think of Prader-Willi syndrome as fundamentally a condition resulting from atypical brain development. And some of the other problems may be secondary to that. So scoliosis may be secondary to the hypertonia. So understanding the brain is really key to developing new treatments, certainly treatments around some of the mental health and psychiatric problems. But I think we're also coming up with this idea that was mentioned, I think, for you in your talk, much more about a useful unifying hypothesis here is that Prader-Willi syndrome is about a problem with homeostasis, the ability that is developed through evolution, whereby we as animals cope with the demands of the environment. And we normally think of that in terms of temperature regulation. If it's hot outside, we sweat so that we keep our temperature very stable. But it's also relevant in terms of energy balance, so the amount we eat matches our energy needs, so we don't put on weight and we don't lose weight. But it's also relevant in terms of emotional regulation. So I think this concept of homeostasis is a really important one. But the next slide, I think, tries to illustrate the complexity of all of this. So again, you've got the genes on the left-hand side here affecting the development of the central nervous system or the brain. It gives rise to a particular phenotype. It may be as a consequence of the endocrine problems or cognition or whatever. But you then have the individual with Prader-Willi syndrome, and that individual with Prader-Willi syndrome is subject to the same influences that all of us are subject to. We all have individual genetic variations, which makes us look the way we are and to some extent behave the way we are. I may be one of the few people here that had someone in his life who was absolutely identical to me because I'm an identical twin. Anyone else an identical twin here as a matter of interest? So we shared exactly the same DNA, but all of you, all of us are different in our DNA. And we have the same genes, but there'll be subtle variations. So there's always that individual genetic background that gives rise to your hair color, whether you're put on weight, and all those sorts of things. But also we have different environments, and the environment that we live in and we grow up in may well influence the future, the way we are in the future. And there's some very interesting work done years ago from the Dutch famine, for example, during the war, when a lot of the women who were pregnant were in conditions of starvation because of the occupation, and that their babies that they subsequently had were much more prone to obesity. And that led to the idea that maybe the environmental conditions that around the time of pregnancy programmed the baby for how the risks that they might have in future life. So the challenge of research is to try and make sense of what's the core aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome, which are shared by all people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and to what extent do individual variations impact on that, and life circumstances, whether you have opportunities for good schooling. And in Ipso, we hear, of course, of people with Prader-Willi syndrome who don't have those opportunities. So I hope that sets for you the scene a bit, and research is trying to tease that out. Now, I want to just sort of illustrate this a bit with the issue of the eating, the hyperphagia. And I showed this slide yesterday, but on the top left is the weight chart of the first person I ever saw with Prader-Willi syndrome, who, when she became independent at 18, put on an enormous amount of weight. And the parents had tried to persuade the staff where she lived to lock the cupboards, and they refused to do so. And that led us to do a study in London in which we asked a control group of people and a group of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, and they had an hour's access to food, and we plotted how much they ate. And we also asked them to rate how hungry they felt, how full they felt, how strong their desire to eat on an analog scale. And that's shown in the top right-hand graph, which is the scale of how hungry they were. And none of this is any surprise, but what it showed is that people with Prader-Willi syndrome in fact, they ate on average 3 times more calories during that hour than the typically developing people. But what was interesting here is that they did eventually rate that they lost the sense of hunger. So they did satiate, but they needed 3 times more calories to do that. And also that feeling of hunger bounced back much more quickly after they stopped eating, after we removed the sandwiches at the end of an hour, than the control group did. And that led us to argue that people with Prader-Willi syndrome don't have an absent satiety response, they have an insensitive satiety response. And we went on to do a further study, which I'm not going to show the details. We were able to demonstrate that using brain scanning. Now, I think the importance of an observation such as this is it does suggest that it's possible to treat the hyperphagia because it's manipulable. It's not as if it's completely absent, then you would worry. It was there, it was just insensitive. So I think this is why it's such exciting times. And this just illustrates the schema now, the way we think about the satiety cascade. And this is taken from a textbook. Sadaf Farouk is a chapter in that textbook. But you'll be aware that the cascade is that as we eat, there's a feedback mechanisms to the brain, and ultimately to the hypothalamus, and then to the cortex, the conscious parts, if you like, the area of the brain that's responsible for consciousness, that changes our cognitions. So it changes the way we feel, hungry or not hungry, full or not full, and so on. And of course, what requires to change behavior is a change in cognitions. So I'll come back in a moment to the idea that we must think about the hypothalamus, but we must move beyond the hypothalamus to look at where it's connected and how it changes, how activation of the hypothalamus and other areas of the brain can change behavior. But this feedback is through chemicals that are released into the blood and enter the brain, and particularly through the vagus nerve. These are important feedback mechanisms. At the level of the hypothalamus, I'm sorry this will be difficult for you to see it back. You've got the other screen there. But this is just a diagram illustrating the hypothalamus. The point I want to make here is what we know about the hypothalamus, and this is so often the case with biological systems, is that there are, in a sense, 2 systems, one that is driving the eating and the other that is trying to switch off the eating. And by those acting together, you get very fine control of energy balance, because what evolution has, in a sense, shaped in us is the ability to ensure that we eat enough to meet our energy needs, but not too much that we become obese, because that in itself would carry risks and our genes wouldn't be passed on. And in fact, animals are really pretty good at managing that energy balance. But of course, for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, it's this that is so problematic. So I now want to just show what I want to illustrate here, and I talked about this a bit yesterday, but is how occasionally in research there's something you do or someone else does that I think changes the way you think about the issues. And this was a scanning study that Stephanie Brown in Cambridge led, and she's a very skilled neuroimaging person. And she found that there was a new technique for imaging the hypothalamus. It hadn't been possible until very recently because it's small, it's in the center of the brain, and it was very hard to develop the algorithms that would mark out the hypothalamus. But she showed that you can see this in the first column here, the green column, that the hypothalamus is smaller in people with Prader-Willi syndrome compared to people who are the same age but typically developing, and compared to another group who had obesity but didn't have Prader-Willi syndrome. But she also went on to show that the smaller the hypothalamus, the greater the weight, the BMI, and also the higher the score on a hyperphagia questionnaire. So it seemed, to me at least, that this was potentially an explanation for the hyperphagia and all the other aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome that you listed that are related to hypothalamic problems, the hormonal problems, the temperature regulation, and so on. So the thinking here is that you have a small and therefore essentially inefficient hypothalamus. But the other, sorry, this is, I can go back. The other thing that I think is important here is to ask what about connections from the hypothalamus to other areas of the brain. And this is the stage we're at with the research at the moment. And there are, again, very, very clever techniques that people can use to look at connectivity between, say, the hypothalamus and different areas of the brain. So what we've become interested in is how does the hypothalamus communicate to these other areas, and particularly, therefore, how it might change behavior through changing cognitions. And by doing that, we can identify those networks in the brain that may be important and which we could try and influence in order to both evaluate agents that are treating hyperphagia as well as better understanding hyperphagia. And you can see the color coding is the way that the computer algorithms mark the level of activity between the hypothalamus in the center of the brain there and other areas of the brain. But for me, it now raises the question, not so much how genetics explains the hyperphagia, but how genetics explains a hypothalamus that is poorly developed. That, for me, is an important shift in my own thinking about Prader-Willi syndrome. So this is illustrated there. So the question now, and I said in my title, more questions but some answers. So is the structural abnormality of the hypothalamus sufficient to explain the hyperphagia? Or are there other abnormalities, perhaps related to gene expression, that still contributes to the presence of hyperphagia? And ultimately, what are the implications for treatment? So I just want to use this to illustrate to you how research is beginning to inform our thinking, in this case about hyperphagia. Now, I want to take us now to the issue of trials, but I may not have all of them here. But I just want to say, what's important, I think, about these clinical trials, and I've listed them. I've listed the name of the agent being tested, summarized its mode of action, and said where it's thought to be acting, whether it's in the gut or the hypothalamus or whatever. But the real point I want to make here is what's really exciting about this is most of the trials are acting on different pathways. They're different agents acting on different pathways. So when a trial is negative, it's disappointing, but it's still useful, because it's sort of telling us that maybe that particular pathway that agent was acting on is not the pathway that we need to work on in order to stop the hyperphagia in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. So, that's why maybe if ARD101 is successful, that would also tell us that the pathway that's acting on is the pathway we need to be thinking about. So these trials are not only important for testing an agent, but they're important as a way of probing the system to help us understand the biology behind the hyperphagia. And I've marked at the bottom the ones that I think have stopped either because they were not effective. So one very interesting one, I think, is the agents that act on the ghrelin pathway. And people got very excited when it was shown that people with Prader-Willi syndrome had high levels of ghrelin, ghrelin being the hormone that drives eating behavior. But in fact, other studies showed that even when you reduce the ghrelin by various means, people with Prader-Willi syndrome still overate. So it didn't seem to be the ghrelin. So then endocrinologists always find a different way of thinking about it. It came up with some new ideas, but I think the trials that have generally have not been successful, which suggests that that pathway isn't the one that we should be focusing on. I may be wrong about that, but I think I just want to illustrate the sort of thinking here. So I just want to, yeah. So I'm going to move in a moment on to emotional outbursts, but I just want to, in the context of that slide about trials, just to say something very briefly about some of the challenges for clinical trials in Prader-Willi syndrome. And IPSO, together with the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research, are writing a paper about this in order to try and inform the whole process of trials, because it has been disappointing that some trials have failed for various reasons. But I think there are three problems that I've highlighted here. First, Prader-Willi syndrome is a relatively rare, it's not that rare, but it's a relatively rare condition. But sometimes if you have to divide it according to genetic subtype, or you can only take a certain age group, or you have to exclude people on certain medications, suddenly the people that are eligible for a trial get smaller and smaller and smaller. So, and you find in America where most of the trials have been, I mean, it's been amazing, but they're beginning to run out of participants. I think there's an exhaustion among some families there because their sons or daughter have been taking part in different trials. So therefore, extending to the UK or Australia is really a very important development. So I really would urge you to engage in the trial process, because I really genuinely believe that there is going to be a treatment that comes out of this. The second problem has been what's called the clinical endpoints in the trial. And this is to do with the regulation, the regulatory authorities like the Federal Drug Administration or in Europe, the European Medicines Agency, the organizations that approve whether or look at the results of trials and decide whether to approve a drug and say it's safe and can be used. And there's been a lot of discussion about what that should be. In earlier trials, it was usually BMI, but that's a problem because so many people now with Prader-Willi syndrome live in food-contained environments, so they were not obese. And also, almost certainly wouldn't lose weight even if the drug was effective. So then they moved to the hyperphagia questionnaire, and that has its problems and so on. So there are challenges to these trials around the idea of what is it that you should measure and what is acceptable to regulatory agents when they're looking to whether or not to approve a drug. And the third thing, which I think is really, for me, is very important, and that's the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. So you may see that a drug seems to have efficacy in that it shifts your ratings on the hyperphagia questionnaire. But actually what matters is in the real world, does that mean your son or daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome can walk down the street without going into the shop and trying to steal some sweets or whatever it is? That's what matters. And that's what we want to see. And the studies aren't really exploring that in sufficient detail. What you are seeing is parents telling stories about their experience of trials, and sometimes that gives you some insight into it. We're okay, we've got 5 minutes, okay, no problem. Quickly, I'll just quickly say about outbursts. I think we have an understanding about them, and the approach has been generally around psychological interventions to try and manage outbursts. But for me, here is an example when we did the vagus nerve stimulation trial. That transformed my own thinking about these outbursts, because what we showed is vagus nerve stimulation over time significantly reduced the number of outbursts. And parents came to us and said, this has transformed our child's life, and so on and so forth. And you can see some quotes there. Before you couldn't challenge him on certain things, but now you can, and he's prepared to sit and listen and so on. And now Deepan Singh is the PI on a large trial that is being funded by, or being undertaken by PWR in America. But the point about it, it shifted one's emphasis, I think, much more towards emotional regulation and the autonomic nervous system that is shown in the diagram at the top. So also as the far right is the psychological model of how the environment shapes behavior, that's still important. But I think what we see now, that the main driver of these outbursts is the biological problem of emotional regulation because of impairment of the autonomic nervous system. So I think the questions here are impairments in autonomic nervous system functioning the main driver to the increased risk of emotional outbursts? I think the answer is probably going to be yes. What are the implications for treatment? Well, the implications are you need to look at the autonomic nervous system and how you improve that, and maybe vagus nerve stimulation is the answer. And I think very interestingly, are hyperphagia and emotional outbursts linked? So if you have an effective treatment for hyperphagia, do you stop the emotional outbursts? My guess is yes, but let's wait and see. DCCR seems to suggest that you might. Now, just quickly to this issue of pharmacogenetics or pharmacodynamics. Now, I have to admit, and I'm going to declare this, skeptical about this, not because I don't think it's really important. It's all part of personalized medicine. But I'm not certain this is the issue at the moment in Prader-Willi syndrome. So that's why I've entitled it When Medications Don't Work. Because the main reason medications don't work in Prader-Willi syndrome is probably because they've been given for something where they wouldn't work anyhow. If you like, it's like giving an antibiotic to treat a virus infection. It's not going to treat a virus infection. The antibiotics treat a bacterial infection. So I think an incorrect diagnosis is probably the main reason why things don't work. Another reason is, of course, people don't take the medication. But in addition to that, we do know, just like we talked about variation earlier, that people vary in the way, because of their genetics, they vary in the way they handle medications. And also there are important interactions with other medications. So the whole field of pharmacogenetics or pharmacodynamics is a way of trying to answer that question. Why do people who should respond, have a condition that should respond to medication, not respond? And it may be because of other medications, but it may be because the genetic variants they have means that they metabolize the drug very quickly, so the blood level never reaches the level it should. So there may be a number of reasons for that. And the person that's been doing most of the work here is Janice Foster. And here she defines in her paper how pharmacogenomics is how the influence of individual variation, what's called polymorphisms, and resultant variations in gene products may impact the response to medication. And she talks about the different neurotransmitters and then the drugs used to impact those neurotransmitter systems and how their activity may vary. So she's looked at antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, antipsychotics, and so on. And here's just, it's difficult to see, but it's difficult to make it any bigger, getting it from the paper. But this is just an example. What she has shown so far is, if you look at the variation within a population of different genetic profile that means that certain drugs will be handled differently, you find that variation is rather similar in the Prader-Willi population. What she hasn't as yet looked at is whether having Prader-Willi syndrome means that you handle drugs differently or not. So this is an important field, but I think we've got to be really clear that at the moment, my own feeling is that I think it's too soon to think that this is something that is going to radically change the way we think about treatment in Prader-Willi syndrome. It may come to that at some point, as it will for all of us. So people with Prader-Willi syndrome are no different from that point of view. Now, Janice, if she was here, would disagree with that, and that we could argue about that. So it's a very important field, but quite whether it's relevant to Prader-Willi syndrome at the moment, I think, is another question. So, the implications are that really we need a better understanding of the role of psychiatric medication, the risks and benefits. And they clearly have their place, and as Deepan said, you should not demonize them. But I think we haven't quite decided where that place is at the moment. There's a question about whether people with Prader-Willi syndrome are more sensitive to and at increased risk for the use of psychiatric treatments, and if so, why? And then ultimately, there's the question, where might pharmacodynamic or pharmacogenetic studies fit in our clinical practice? And my argument would be, as I say, that we're not quite there yet. So I just want to end, really, by just reflecting on the range of research that is being done and has been done over the years around Prader-Willi syndrome, from applied research to basic science research. And I want to use this, because I want to use this as a tool, if you like, to remind you that treatment isn't simply about prescribing a tablet. Treatment is about the quality of the environment where someone lives. It's about the support to you as parents so that you're better able and have the energy to support your son and daughter. It's about there being opportunity for adults in terms of employment or whatever it is in society. It's about having the right communication environment. It's having controls over access to food and all those sorts of things. It is also about, and there will be, treatments like tablets and medication for hyperphagia. There may be vagus nerve stimulation for outbursts and so on. But we mustn't forget these other aspects of the broader concept of treatment. If you have poor social care as someone, adult living in a group home, if that care is poor, no number of tablets are going to alter their behavior until you get that care right. It's absolutely crucial. So just to remind everyone about the hypothalamus, this is just a slide that really tries to bring the homeostatic model together, because I think the problem is that the brain doesn't have reliable inputs either from the gut or from the external world to allow it to make good judgments about how to respond. So I think for someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, they live in a state of uncertainty, and my own feeling is that helps to explain this anxiousness that is so commonly prescribed. So I will, my time is up, so I will just like to acknowledge the people that I've worked with and who are inspiration for our thoughts about Prader-Willi syndrome. But also being involved in IPSO, just to remind you about the conference next year in Phoenix, which I think is going to be very exciting as it brings together the USA Association, ourselves, and the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research. There is air conditioning. I know Phoenix is the hottest city in America, but there is air conditioning, and the accommodation is really nice, and there's a wonderful swimming pool with slides. So thank you very much.